All right, well, I would like to start off by welcoming everyone to the webinar related to our model code for student organization conduct. My name is Gentry McCreary. I'm the CEO and managing partner of Dyad Strategies, and I had the privilege of working with this outstanding team over the last several months to put this model code together. And before we begin telling you about that process and the product that we developed, I would like the rest of my development team and the folks who are the really leading force behind putting this policy together to introduce themselves. And so we'll go in order in terms of the list of authors on the code. So Dr. Jonathan Sanders.
Yes, I'm Jonathan Sanders. I have the pleasure, privilege serving as the Associate Dean and Director of Student Advocacy and Accountability at Louisiana State University. I've been in this role approximately 4 years, but prior to that, I've served in a role in Greek life for 10 years at LSU, where I had the privilege of working to create a partnership process with some other colleagues. That then went on to lead to my dissertation research, how universities address conduct issues with fraternities and sororities, where I've been engaged in that conversation ever since.
Next, we have Scott Lewis from T&G Consulting. Scott, if you'd introduce yourself.
Hi, my name is Scott Lewis, and I'm a partner with T&G Consulting, formerly also known as the Encrum Group. We are a legal and risk management firm headquartered in Pennsylvania, but located all over the country, and try to bring the sort of risk management, administrative, legal lens to this project, and really was honored that Gentry asked us to be a part of it. And we'll be talking also about some of the tie-in to Title IX with this as well through ATICSA, which is the Association of Title IX Administrators. Thanks, Ginger.
Thanks, Scott. Next, Isabel Caputo from Denver University.
Yes, hello everyone. My name is Isabel Caputo. I'm the Associate Director of Student Rights and Responsibilities at the University of Denver. I've been at DU for about 2.5 years now, working in student conduct. Previously to that, I had the pleasure of working as a fraternity sorority advisor at a small institution. But being the primary and only person working in fraternity and sorority life there, I also oversaw the conduct process, and we'll talk a little bit about how lovely that dual role is, and I'm really excited to be here.
And last but certainly not least, Dr. Jeremiah Shin.
Hello, I'm Jeremiah. Serve as the Vice President for Student Affairs at Louisiana State University. I've spent a lot of time in this conversation. I spent 7 years on the board of the Association of Fraternity and Sorority Advisors. I'm currently on the board for the Association of Fraternal Leadership and Values. And I frequently work with headquarters partners and folks at a national level who are trying to find a way to help fraternities, sororities, and campuses work more in concert together. And certainly this is a point of friction in that conversation, but I think also an opportunity to come together and do some really great things.
So I think what you see with this team is both a diversity in terms of their approach to this issue. Jonathan is a scholar, Scott looking at it through the lens of the legal implications, Isabella is a practitioner working on both the fraternity and sorority and the conduct side, and Jeremiah is a chief student affairs officer really seeing this from the 30,000-foot view. So I couldn't think of a better team, and was thrilled that this group was willing to work with us in the development of this policy. I'm going to share my screen now and pull up our slide deck, and we will begin the formal part of our presentation, but wanted you to be able to see and get to know everyone that you will be talking to today. So again, this is our webinar related to the model code of student organization conduct. If you would like to follow along on Twitter, use the hashtag Dyad model code. You have met our team. Well, now my computer's freezing up. My apologies, everyone.
While that's happening, Gentry, why don't we just remind everybody that if you have any questions, please use the Q&A button at the bottom as opposed to the chat function. The chat function will say for if you have any technical issues or something like that, but please use the Q&A function. And is there a link to the slides that will be used in this presentation?
It will be
Gentry?
provided to all participants, yes, following the presentation. Wanted to quickly here review the learning outcomes of the webinar today, and just to give you an idea of where we're going, really to be able to articulate the need for a transparent organizational conduct process that builds trust and goodwill with students and stakeholders, and to further contextualize this within the lens of Gen Z's struggles to manage conflict and self-govern, and the need for a process of organizational misconduct that encourages and incentivizes self-governance, to be able to articulate the three-tier conduct process that we've developed in this model code, and to begin thinking about which of your common violations would fall under each of those tiers, to be able to articulate the advantages of a collaborative outcomes process over a traditional unilateral sanctioning model, and lastly, but to be able to identify and implement some best practices as it relates to the implementation of this code. As I shared yesterday in the email that I sent all participants, our hope and expectation is that you've at least done a cursory review of the model code prior to this webinar, because we don't plan on getting into the nuts and bolts of the policy itself, but covering it from a very high level to go over some of the main features, and then to save plenty of time at the end for Q&A. So just as you think about timeline, there are 90 minutes scheduled for the webinar today. We plan on spending the first 50 or so diving into the particulars and discussing best practices, and then saving 30 to 40 minutes at the end for the Q&A. So really, again, appreciate everyone being here. We wanted to start with providing you with some context. Why a model code of student organization conduct? Why now? And the background against which this model code is presented. And so to begin that conversation, I will turn it over to Jeremiah.
Thanks, Gentry. Yeah, when we think about approaching this model code, and we think about the reasons for why this is necessary, there are three things that we'd like to focus on as antecedents for this conversation: inconsistency, tension, and also health and safety. So the first being inconsistency. So there are nearly 2,500 four-year institutions in the United States. And certainly most of those have organized student groups in some way, shape, or form. About 570 of those campuses have fraternities and sororities. And while this conversation is not limited to that group, it's certainly one of the major drivers that should be considered. The only common denominator among those institutions is that they really happen to be located in the same country. There's nothing that would otherwise cause them to have a through line through those model codes. And so we saw that as a tremendous opportunity. And so because of that, because of the disparate nature of these organizations and the far-flung nature of some of them, this would understandably result in inconsistency between institutional approaches. And some of that inconsistency is further, we can further see it show up in the conduct processes because there are several things that are happening. We have hastily conceived organizational processes. We have campuses that saw the need for it. We put something together. We ran with it for whatever reason. We have some that are developed in response to a crisis. And certainly while we're in crisis mode, that's not the optimal time to be developing these approaches, but certainly we see some that resulted from crisis. And I think the other thing that we see is that some of the organizational conduct processes are basically wedged into our individual conduct processes. And we know that those have different dynamics and necessarily require that we move through them differently. And we're not suggesting through this that there's one right way, but there are certainly some ways that are more useful than others. And we hope to provide a baseline for that conversation. The second thing we'd like to speak to or issue as a baseline for the conversation is the tension between campuses and we'll call them external entities. Again, sometimes that shows up as fraternity or sorority headquarters. It might show up as other things as well, but there's a tension sometimes between campus entities and external entities. And we're not here to debate who's more right in these situations. And there's certainly cases to be made on all sides of that. But basically what we've seen play out time and time again, and we'll just use again a fraternity as an example. A fraternity is alleged to have committed a violation. That violation might be considered via one of the flawed processes that we mentioned before. Maybe it's not timely, maybe there's insufficient due process, maybe it's hastily conceived, internally inconsistent. Or the campus might choose to not follow a process that it does have. And so because of that, the external entity is frustrated and finds that it would be more palatable to just go it alone than to continue the partnership with that particular campus, which results in either an unrecognized group or the lack of a partnership, which is something that we don't want. And at the end of the day, it's something that we don't, that's not good for our students. And so those are some of the areas of tension that we hope we can begin the process of resolving through this conversation. Then the third thing that I'll mention as a contextual factor is health and safety. We don't have to rehash all the reasons why health and safety continue to be a concern, but we believe that a fair, consistently applied, well-conceived, and widely understood conduct process is one part of building culture of health and safety through accountability. And so that's what we're hoping that we can establish with this, and that's where we're beginning this conversation.
And as we began this conversation, it was important to think about beyond the national landscape, as Jeremiah has laid out, what's happening with our students? What's the context of the developmental characteristics of Gen Z and this group of students who are on our campus now? And if there's a book that I would recommend to anyone who's working in higher ed and student affairs that was published in the last few years, it would be The Coddling of the American Mind by Greg Lukianoff and Jonathan Haidt. And they cover a lot of ground in that book, but in particular, they highlight a growing body of literature related to some of the challenges associated with this post-millennial generation that are often referred to as Gen Z. And one of the things that we know about this generation is that their parents were very hyperprotective of them as they were growing up. And we've known and thought and talked in student affairs about helicopter parents for a long time now, but it continues to be a challenge. And what we're now seeing show up in literature and psychological studies is the impact of overparenting and overprotectivity. And one of the very clear trends that have emerged with this generation that is now in college and makes up the majority of our traditional aged undergraduates is that because of that helicopter parenting, because of the way they were raised, they received much less of what psychologists refer to as unsupervised, unstructured playtime. Their parents were always around, even when they went to play with their friends, it was a play date. And parents were always close by. And if you juxtapose that against previous generations, several millennials and Gen Xers on this webinar who probably share my background and upbringing, which was that when I got home from school in the afternoon or got up on a Saturday morning, I was able to run off with my neighborhood friends and go off and play for hours at a time with no adults around from a fairly early age. And so as we did that, as conflict inevitably arose between and amongst my peers, we were able to resolve those conflicts. And so we built experience and we built some self-efficacy around resolving conflict with our peers. This generation, because of that lack of unsupervised, unstructured playtime, got much less experience resolving conflict because the minute conflict broke out, the parents who were nearby, instead of letting that conflict run its course, immediately jumped in and mediated the conflict themselves. And so as a result, we have an entire generation of young people who come to college lacking some very basic conflict resolution skills, and not because they're developmentally challenged, but simply put, because they lacked those experiences as children and adolescents. This developmental consideration has a tremendous impact and provides a really important context for the development of this model code, because for years we have relied on these models of self-governance, and that's a word that we hear a lot, particularly when we talk about fraternities and sororities, but other student organizations as well. And what we know is that in recent years, self-governance has not been working that well, and it's particularly because of this side effect of overparenting, that because students lack the ability to resolve conflict, they are less able to hold one another accountable and self-govern in a way that provides for those safe and healthy campuses that Jeremiah discussed. So in developing a model code, what we wanted to do was to consider things that both incentivized self-governance and taught and gave students the opportunity to learn to self-govern, because we can no longer operate in an environment just assuming that these systems are up and functioning the way they should be, when everything we know about this generation tells me that this is an area where they really struggle. The other consideration we have to think about is the spike in cases that we've seen, that more and more time is taken up among university administrators responding to allegations of malfeasance within college campus student organizations, not necessarily fraternities and sororities, but certainly they are considered in that group. And so what we found is that many of my friends in student conduct are on the webinar. As our offices have become overloaded with cases in academic misconduct and new expectations regarding Title IX, that we've looked for opportunities to outsource some of the work that we've done. And much of that work, particularly with cases involving fraternities and sororities, has been outsourced to fraternity and sorority life offices. And so we've got a lot of folks who are doing fraternity and sorority advising, who core to their job responsibilities is investigating and being involved in these allegations of misconduct, which puts those fraternity and sorority advisors in a really weird position. So another thing that we wanted to address in developing this model code is to recognize that fraternity and sorority professionals often find themselves in this organizational discipline process, but that they really shouldn't. It makes their jobs harder. They lose trust. They lose the ability to do the things that we need them to do, puts them in a very difficult situation. But we also want to acknowledge that offices of student conduct across the country have increasing caseloads. They're dealing with more and more problems. They're dealing with more and more issues. And so we don't need to overburden them with these even sometimes low-level organizational issues that could be addressed in other ways. And so this model code really tries to strike that balance of the level of involvement that fraternity and sorority professionals have without getting them directly involved in the investigative process. The last thing that we considered contextually as we began the process of developing this code was what we identified as our top 4 goals of an organizational misconduct process. When you think about what it is you're trying to accomplish as a result of going through a misconduct process of an investigation, potentially a hearing, educational outcomes, what is it we're trying to do at the end of the day? And our team identified really 4 things. The first thing is ultimately behavior change. The organization was hazing. We took you through this process, and the goal of this process and the outcomes that we put in place is that you will stop doing this thing that you were doing prior. And so behavior change is an important outcome. As Jeremiah noted, the second outcome we discussed is this idea of promoting healthier campus cultures. So beyond just changing the behavior of individuals within an organization, really we want to think about that larger external environment and making sure that the processes and the education and the things that we're doing aren't just changing the behavior of those organizations, but are ultimately promoting a healthier environment for everyone. Thirdly, as mentioned before, we wanted to encourage and incentivize self-governance, knowing that that's something that this generation in particular struggles with. Now, and lastly, and one that's often overlooked, but Jeremiah alluded to this, is that the goal of a good organizational misconduct process is that it should actually build trust and goodwill between the institution and the student organizations and the stakeholders, including advisors, representatives from national organizations. And oftentimes we see that the opposite is true, that there's a lack of transparency, there's a perceived lack of good faith, and there's an increasing tension that comes about as a result of an organization going through an investigation and a misconduct proceeding, and it doesn't have to be that way. So we really built this model code with an eye towards transparency, with an eye towards organizational rights, and we hope that we've accomplished that goal. And one of the things that I often do, and I've presented these 4 goals at some conferences over the years, I will ask participants, and we'll ask you, and as you're thinking about your own code and your own policy now, on a scale of 1 to 10, how well you would rate your current org conduct system at promoting or achieving each of those goals. And my experience is that most folks don't give themselves very high marks. And so this model code is really presented with these goals in mind. And with that, we are going to get into an overview of the 3-tier model. And to set us up for this conversation, I want to turn it back over to Jeremiah, who will give you the analogy of how we put this process together.
In society, we don't have one way to deal with all types of infractions. If I go downtown, park, don't pay the meter, I get a parking ticket. That's a civil infraction. I know the fine is $25. I don't go before a judge. I go pay the parking ticket and it's done. I certainly could challenge it, and I could elongate the process, but pretty much that's just something that's prescribed. We have misdemeanors, public intoxication, simple battery. These are things that are a little bit more than a prescribed fine. I've still got to go through a process, but we're not yet risking life and limb in that process. And so those are misdemeanors. And then we get up to felonious activity where we're talking about murder and aggravated assault. This is where I'm going before a jury of my peers, and certainly massive sanctions are at least possible as an outcome. And so civil infractions, misdemeanors, and felonies are the way that we've chosen in our society to navigate the complexity associated with running afoul of our expectations for one another in society. The same is true in an organizational misconduct perspective. There are low-tier violations, there are middle-tier violations, and there are higher-level violations. And we've suggested, as is in front of you, we've suggested how you might look through those. But I think our advocacy is that we start looking at these things a little bit differently. There are some violations, such as social event policies, unregistered events, and so on and so forth. We know what the policy is. That's a prescribed outcome, and we move on through that. There are middle level things that are academic misconduct, disorderly conduct. That's where we might engage in a partnership process between the university and that organization or a national representative to talk about how do we work together to figure out how we can learn forward in this event. How do we use this as an opportunity for learning and education? And certainly there are those things that are egregious, and those are investigated and adjudicated and dealt with swiftly, and certainly we take those very seriously, and the outcomes are likely to be far more dire than they are at level 1 or level 2. And so the point is that we get to inject some nuance into this conversation, because especially as we're working with college students, if we treat everything as a tier 3 violation, that's not a way to build trust, because every college student knows that there's a difference between hazing and violating one's social event policy. And I think that we're at our best when we acknowledge that and act accordingly. So we're going to proceed with this in mind as we move forward through this process.
So as we get into the details of the code and the policy itself, and before we get into the specifics of those 3 tiers, some information in the code related to jurisdiction and some other considerations. So Scott, if you will lead us through a conversation of the jurisdictional considerations in the model code.
For sure. Before I do that, Gentry, we had somebody ask if you could repeat the title and authors of the book that you referenced earlier.
Yeah, absolutely. Happy to. It's The Coddling of the American Mind, and the authors are Jonathan Haidt, Haidt. He's a professor at NYU, and then Greg Lukianoff, who is with FIRE, the Foundation for Individual Rights in Education. And the book was published about a year and a half ago. I forget the exact publication date, but The Coddling of the American Mind is the title of the book.
Yeah, and there was another question posted that we'll get to, I think, a little bit later. We can talk now, Gentry. You're going to talk later about all the different groups that were asked to comment on the model code that we got back to, right?
Yeah, absolutely.
Great. We'll do that at the end. Thanks so much for those questions. Shifting to jurisdiction, this is really not to be thought of as like Law School 101, but certainly something to think about in terms of whether or not we're even going to assert jurisdiction over this. So when you heard Jeremiah speaking a moment ago about the different types of policy violations, we have to decide what types of policies we have. So what we try to do in the code is outline the violations that we thought the institution should assert subject matter jurisdiction over or not. So if the organization has rules that govern the organization, a lot of them mirror the rules that are governing the individual students and faculty and staff. And so that first question, as you're looking at it, is this even covered under one of our policies? Because if it's not, then you would not have the jurisdiction over the behavior as an organization, while you might still have it over the individuals. And we'll talk more about that when we get into resolution. If the organization is not recognized by the institution officially, then you really can't have jurisdiction over the organization. And that's kind of tied to what we call personal jurisdiction. Do we have jurisdiction over the individuals in the organization? So if you have organizations where we recognize the organization, but we allow the organization to have members who are not our students, faculty, and staff, we have to recognize the limited jurisdiction we have over the people in the organization, while we still may have jurisdiction over the organization. And I know we've talked a lot about Greek life, but you'll see this sometimes play out in certain types of clubs and sporting organizations like sports clubs, where you have like a rugby club that wants to play for the city, but it's primarily focused on the school, but we allow a couple of people who aren't students or maybe not to affiliate with the club to help coach it or to help train with it or to help play on it. So those are a few examples where the jurisdiction can get just a little tricky. Citywide chapters would be another example if we get into the Greek side. Yep. So then we have to decide, are we going to assert jurisdiction over off-campus things? And not to let the cat out of the bag too much, but the new Title IX regulations that were just released yesterday were very clear. And in fact, in the webinar that the Office of Civil Rights put out, they referenced directly for off-campus fraternity houses as the example of off-campus or recognized organizations with off-campus homes or buildings. And so that's the exact example they use, so we know exactly where their mindset was. So we do typically assert off-campus jurisdiction when it's an organization that is recognized by the institution, because we look at the downstream effect that the behavior might have, which takes us right back to the health and safety consideration Jeremiah referenced earlier. And so this issue of registered versus non-registered events becomes a bit of a trickier jurisdictional limitation. If you're going to say, oh, we're only going to do it if it's a registered event, then you've got to get into these really deep discussions about, well, is it registered? Is it not registered? Is it kind of registered? And the courts have commented on this over time to say, you know, what does it really matter? The reality is, if it's enough people in one place and it seems registered, you know, if it has feathers and it's waddling and it has a bill, then it's a duck. And we don't really need to have a lot of arguing about it. So you'll see in the model code some discussions of the expanded jurisdiction there. And the last one, which we actually got some commentary back on, was the statutes of limitations. And generally speaking, what you don't want to have is a statute of limitations on behavior, because all of these other jurisdictional elements will limit you already, and you don't need to add a time limit. So I've seen statutes of limitations in student conduct codes and in codes surrounding Title IX issues where they say things like, you have to file the complaint within 6 months of the date of the incident. And there's no real reason for that other than people say, gosh, well, 6 months later, it's harder to investigate something because some of the people may have graduated, or maybe the people have, the organization is completely turned over at this point. And some of the witnesses aren't even here anymore, and they're not going to remember what happened. Well, those are reasons to weight evidence differently. And those are reasons to think about how you might not have jurisdiction over some of the people involved. But organizationally, you still might want to assert that jurisdiction because it could be a systemic problem. So just because someone brings a complaint about a club or a Greek organization or a sports club that was hazing 3 years ago, and you're like, that's just too far away, and some of the people aren't here anymore, we still want to look into the organization to maybe see if it's a systemic problem. We do this all the time on the sex world. When I did a lot of work with the United States Center for Safe Sport, we go back 30, 40, 50 years to see if there's systemic problems inside the organization. There isn't one. Then turning on to early resolution, this is one of those things I think the prescribed process can have in there. And it's even before the prescribed process, right? This is back in the day, Gentry, when you and I were working together, we call these the smoke only cases, right? This is the ones for you folks who came up through Res Life, you'll probably remember this. This is the one where you have the person who, you're down at the end of the residence hall, everybody can smell the marijuana, but we can never tell what room it's coming out of. And whenever you do the room check, there's never anything there. But you can have that deanly conversation with those students to talk about what the outcomes might look like if they were to violate policy, or if they haven't gone far enough, what the trajectory they're on is. And then we would file those cases, what we call FIO, and that's for information only. I mean, invented this a long time ago so that we could document that conversation. So if the individual, and in our case now the organization, comes back and says, gosh, we didn't know it could be that bad. Well, sure you did, because we had a whole conversation about it. And we documented that conversation. We documented who we had. But for record keeping purposes, that doesn't serve as a violation. It's just a conversation we had about, hey, if you keep on this trajectory, here's what'll happen. Or, hey, here's what the rule we think you might have violated is. And if you do, this is what the consequence for that looks like. So just we're all on the same page. And I think I want to hand it over now, Gentry, but I'll hand it back to you for talking about these Tier 1 prescribed outcomes. You're muted, Gentry.
We're going to go through each of the 3 specific tiers, and Jonathan and Isabel will actually lead us through this part of the presentation. So Isabel will walk us through those violations that would fall under Tier 1, the prescribed outcomes process.
Yeah, thanks, Gentry. So the Tier 1 is really what we're talking about with low-level violations and clear-cut ones. Like Scott kind of alluded to, if it looks like a duck and quacks like a duck, it's a duck. So these are the ones that we don't have questions about. We know that it happened. We have the evidence that says it happened, and it's a low-level violation again. So one, these low-level violations should be defined by your institution. We provide some examples in the model code, a rubric of these, and also a rubric of kind of what we would recommend for sanctions or outcomes for that. But those really should be defined by you and your institution, depending on your process, what you expect, and what your outcomes look like. We use a lot of fines throughout this, or social restrictions, but maybe that doesn't fall in line with your process, so there is some flexibility there. Some examples of those violations could be, again, social event policies, noise, maybe a fire code violation. Again, things that are pretty clear, it happened, we have the documentation. In the prescribed process, what the model code recommends, basically, this thing happens, here is your outcome. If you accept that, great. Follow through with the outcome and it's closed. If the organization declines to accept, so if there are stipulations, then it would move forward into one of the other tiers for more formal investigation. Again, the model code goes through this more in terms of the rubric and the information that we recommend.
Yeah, so the next part of this is Tier 2, and that's going to be partnership process. When speaking about the partnership process, it's important to note that a traditional process can oftentimes create an environment where a student organization immediately takes a defensive posture. We definitely seen that for our conduct friends when the brick wall gets built and the code of silence begins with a group anytime that they're alleged to have done something wrong. Oftentimes creates an us versus them mentality, creating a win-lose situation that is challenging to overcome. In my view, partnership can create a win-win situation, not us versus them. It is a philosophical shift in our approach, in a way in which we think about conduct processes, and from my own experience can be powerful in creating cultural changes within an organization. The first part of this process is the investigation, and trust on both sides is important. We are trusting students, advisors, and stakeholders, and in turn, they are trusting us. So this is the foundational key component of the partnership process. If trust does not exist, it's very difficult to navigate the partnership process. We believe a tier 2 violation may have occurred. We're first going to give the option for partnership process with the organization, so they are self-selecting in this process. That is very important because they are choosing to participate. They are choosing to partner in this process. Again, giving them options and somewhat control over this process. We're then going to educate them on the process. This would include how to conduct an investigation, what should be included in a written report submitted following the investigation, asking them to be detailed, specific, and more importantly, truthful regarding what occurred and happened, and more importantly, focusing on the why. They themselves know their organizations much better than we do and can get to the why much better than we can sometimes from the university perspective. Once the organization has provided this report, the Dean of Students or designee can do one of the following. Either accepts the report and move on to the next step, which we'll talk about in a few minutes. Accept the report, but note that as individuals involved and does not warrant organizational process, then we will then move forward in addressing those individual behaviors through our code of conduct. Report is insufficient or not complete. Perhaps in this time, we might give the organization another chance or some feedback to complete the report or provide the information we're looking for, but they're unable to do that or provide false information or uncooperative, we are going to move to the formal resolution process. So again, this is a partnership and should be partnership throughout, kind of no matter where we're at in that process. And if it ever breaks down, then we are going to move to that formal resolution process and addressing it through those manners. For the resolution meeting, that's the next step in this partnership process. We're going to look at making sure that that meeting occurs with the registered organization, their advisor, and other appropriate parties as necessary. So this will be the time to include headquarters friends, national organization, other departments perhaps on campus, those types of things. We definitely want to make sure that we have them at the table. The termination during this meeting could be the following. The first one being no policy violation. But of course, we know that education can still occur. And as Scott mentioned earlier, the FIO piece, so for information only, may be filed away as that. We didn't have enough information to say that a policy violation occurred, but there still may be education that can occur for the organization to prevent perhaps future concerns or future possible violations of the code. The next one would be responsibility is fully accepted, then determine appropriate outcomes. Again, these outcomes are agreed upon with the organization and the university. Next option would be responsibility partially accepted or not accepted at all. And we have two decisions then to make if that occurs, and that's either the Dean of Students or designee accepts the partial responsibility. So maybe they accept the alcohol violation, but they don't accept the drug violation. We're willing to move forward with that and create an outcome to address the alcohol piece, but knowing that they didn't take responsibility for the drug piece. Or we don't accept that determination and move forward again to the formal investigation process. Just knowing again that individuals identified will move forward in the code process. So even through this partnership process, individuals identified, we will make sure we do address those behaviors with individual students as well. And at this time, the determinations are final and may not be appealed because again, they were agreed upon. So no need to appeal something that was agreed upon moving forward.
Before we jump on to the next section, there's a couple of questions that came in, and I really want to thank everybody for submitting the questions. And there are some we'll do when we get to the end, is we'll kind of just go back to the questions. We built in the 30 minutes at the end of this just to handle all these questions. So I want to kind of keep the flow going, but keep the questions coming, and then we'll just go back and hit those questions. So that thanks everybody, keep them coming, and we will get to them, don't panic.
So, Isabel, you're up with tier 3.
Yeah, so and then the tier 3, as we talked about, is the formal investigation. So formal investigation in the model code is well laid out with lots of specific information. So highly recommend if you haven't read through that part to read through it, but also allows for some flexibility depending on what your institution's conduct board or conduct committee looks like. So not going to go too in depth into it, but some key recommendations or some key points to know about the formal investigation through this model code is that, of course, at any point in the process, a formal investigation may occur. So if through the partnership process, the organization is not being as actively a part of the process, you might move to the formal investigation. Or again, if in tier 1, if they decline to accept the outcomes, then you would move forward to this. Be as transparent as possible with the organization about when the investigation occurs. So for a formal investigation, we recommend notifying the RSOs, which are the registered student organizations, also as appropriate for the type of violation. So we also want to avoid any sort of circling of the wagons and getting that kind of information put together. But we do want to be transparent and communicate with our organizations and stakeholders through this process as well. We lay out specific time periods within the code, and we really recommend that those are followed and are also communicated to your stakeholders. You want to be clear and concise with all of that information, and then also to follow those time periods in the code. Investigators within the formal investigation tier should be different than the decision makers to allow for non-biased adjudication. And they also shouldn't be people who report directly to decision makers. Again, we want to be clear and forward with our organizations, and we don't want to allow for any potential bias to be perceived or to be actualized. The formal investigation in the model code also provides a review and comment period for organizations. Again, to allow for their active participation in the process. Even at this level, we want some set of self-governance and some active accountability from our organizations, and continuing on with that high level of transparency, providing them the investigative report so that they can comment on that investigative report. And then the formal investigation tier also allows for informal and formal resolution options. So the informal resolution option basically allows the RSO to accept the findings of the formal investigation by the investigator. And if they are taking active accountability there, then we would move forward to the outcomes process directly. If they decline to accept those outcomes and responsibility, then we would move forward to our formal hearing board. So whatever that looks like on your campus should be similar to what that process is, but making sure that you do have specific organizational expectations when you're adjudicating a organizational formal hearing. And that can look either like that formal hearing board or the option of having an administrative hearing. And again, so the administrative hearing would be more of a one-on-one with one decision maker. And again, that decision maker should not be an investigator or be somebody that the investigator reports to.
One of the questions that came up that I think maybe it can best be addressed here is with regards to those council level peer governance boards. And we address that in a footnote within the policy, in that this is written in such a way that it's flexible, that if you're in an institution where the culture and philosophy really emphasizes that peer governance, that IFC judicial board, or that interdisciplinary or rather intramurals governing council, whatever the various organization might be, the model code is set to work within that framework, right? So that if the hearing officer is actually going to be an IFC judicial board, that's then listed as one of the options maybe that the organization can choose from. That I want an informal administrative hearing, I want a formal administrative hearing, or maybe we want a formal hearing in front of that peer governance or accountability board. And we don't have, I won't say strong feelings on the matter. I think each of us have our own feelings on the matter. And so we didn't explicitly address that within the model code, other than in the footnote to say that if your institution prioritizes that and you want to list that as an option, certainly within this formal administrative procedure, that would be one of the options that you could incorporate. You can also incorporate them as the appellate level for those tier 1 type violations. The only place where probably I think we are all on the same page in terms of the development team, we don't really see a place for that in the partnership process. That the partnership process really is between the organization and the institution. And we're going to work with you to self-investigate, self-govern, and work you through those processes. There may be an opportunity on the back end to get that council level feedback, perhaps on the outcomes, but certainly they would be less involved in the back and forth related to the internal investigation itself. But otherwise, the process is set up such that any of those hearing options can be fulfilled by one of those peer governing boards. At this point, want to continue as we've walked through the 3 tiers to talk a little bit about the outcomes development process. And we speak in the preamble and talked earlier in terms of the goals of the process that building trust and goodwill and accountability is an important outcome of this model code. And we think that this outcomes process, replacing the traditional unilateral, we're going to send you a sanction letter of all the things that you've got to do to get back in our good graces, and replacing that with a more collaborative process really is one of the features of this code. And so Jonathan and Isabel will again walk us through some considerations with regards to the outcomes process.
Yeah, so when developing outcomes, it's important to get input from the registered student organization and stakeholder, especially focusing on the why and how we can prevent these concerns from occurring in the future. They know their members much better than we do. They know their culture much better than we do. So asking for that input is very important. I know Isabel's gonna hit on that later on too, in a section that she has as well. Stakeholders is too, including this piece as well, from the national organization to department or other governing body organization. It would be great if they're included in this process. If they're running a parallel investigation, it would be excellent to have one playbook or one sheet of music that everyone is working from moving forward. So taking those outcomes from the national organization, perhaps including them in your own, and vice versa. We've done that, partnered with some groups on that before, and it's worked out well because, again, there's one playbook for the organization to move forward, address the concerns, and hopefully change behavior. Once we determine the outcomes, an outcome letter is sent to the registered organization and stakeholders with the details and dates, being very specific of what we're asking of those folks. Again, hopefully they've had some input on those things, and those won't be a shock or surprise to them, but hopefully find them valuable and useful and truly trying to address the cultural issues that may be going on with the organization. If outcomes are not completed or followed, of course, we can give additional charges under the code, such as failure to comply. So obviously we know that they need to move forward and completing those outcomes as stated. Absent state law, we are recommending to keep records for at least 7 years. If loss of recognition, then records would be maintained indefinitely. Of course, you also want to work with your legal counsel, again, looking at state policies and determine how long you keep those records. I know there are some states and universities that have to keep them less time than that, or perhaps longer than that, based on either institutional policies and or state law. So definitely want to work with your legal counsel on that piece. For the actual outcomes, we developed a couple different options here. You'll see warning is the first option, and this is the status that a group would be put on. This would be simply documenting the concern as a warning, can be for a specific period of time. So perhaps it lasts for 6 months or a year or some time frame such as that. If similar behavior occurs, again, while on a warning status, the organization should expect elevated outcomes because we were given that warning, given the opportunity to correct behavior or change behavior, and perhaps if we're seeing patterns of behavior or concern, then that outcome would need to be elevated. Restriction of privileges would be next. When determining this, truly think about the why, and does this address the actual concern? So I know sometimes off the bat, we think about social restrictions, restriction of activities, and those kinds of things. I'm not saying those things are bad. I do want to say that making sure that there's a why behind those things, that they truly are connected to the behavior and truly going to put the organization back on track to hopefully change behavior and change the culture within the organization. Disciplinary probation would be an elevated outcome from the warning. So organization would not be considered in good standing if on disciplinary probation status, would be for a specific period of time as well, such as the warning we mentioned earlier. Again, just a tier up, a step up from that warning piece. The next step would be a deferred suspension. That would be an elevated outcome. It would include the same provisions as disciplinary probation, and any subsequent violations while in the status could lead to suspension. Obviously, we'd run our process again if any subsequent violations were to occur, but if they were found responsible, especially while being on a deferred suspension status, we know that could lead then to suspension. So think about it as you're kind of like your last straw for the organization. They know are on notice and high alert as far as the concerning behaviors that we've addressed with them. Of course, the ultimate, most punitive outcome possibly we could give as an institution is suspension. We'll cover this more in detail in a few minutes later on. So I think we all kind of know what suspension means, but we'll piece it out more a bit a little bit later on this presentation. We also have educational outcomes. Hopefully all of our processes are educational components or educational components of them. This might include retreats, workshops, or other outcomes determined to help develop the culture and community of the organization. So really being intentional about that and thinking about how we can address the why this occurred with those educational outcomes. We also have structural outcomes as well listed here. My disclaimer is that these may be considered, but only after consultation with appropriate governing body, national organization, or other appropriate stakeholders. This might include developing or revising operating procedures, membership reviews, changes to advisor support, those kinds of things. My personal philosophy is that universities have to be careful of infringing on private organizations' processes and procedures with these structural outcomes. And we want to make sure that we have support of them and the appropriate parties for these types of outcomes before moving forward. So something we wanted to relate to you all as well.
At this point, we will wrap up the code review with the appeals process, and we'll turn it back over to Scott.
Thanks, Gentry. Yeah, there's actually two pieces to this, and one of them is gatekeeping. And I think I want to make sure we understand that gatekeeping just doesn't happen at the appellate level. But gatekeeping is really going on throughout the process. From the moment that report comes in, and we're doing what we refer to in our world of investigations as prelim. We're doing a prelim to take a look. First, do we have jurisdiction? All the stuff we talked about earlier. And then secondly, how much information do we really have? And this is where the early weighting of evidence, WEIGHT, weighting of evidence begins. We start to decide how much do we really have? What do we really know? Who do we need to talk to? Is this a credible, reasonable allegation? And you start moving forward in that direction. But that gatekeeping starts before even a notice of allegation goes out. And there's a question that came in about notice of allegations that we'll get to in a moment. Knowing who your gatekeeper is for that process, and it may at smaller institutions be the same person who's the gatekeeper for the appellate process. At a larger institution, you may have a separate gatekeeper for the appellate process. And that person is really what they're doing is monitoring the appeal. So one thing in higher ed that we, on the whole, have done, I would argue, exceptionally poorly is the way we've structured a lot of our appellate processes. And people like me and some others in the field have constantly fought this notion of everyone gets an appeal no matter what for all the time. And it really talks about changing our nomenclature. And this is what you'll see in the code here. If we flip to that next one, Gentry. Really, we're talking about not just an appeal, but a request for an appeal. Not everything gets an appeal. And that's really the dilemma here is you want to have somebody asking. And this is when the courts and outside entities take a look at the way we run our appellate processes. They don't generally understand, why a Jeremiah gets to read every appeal because then you're reading all the information that the appeal is based on before even checking to see, does it even meet one of our grounds for appeal? So you'll see outlined in this model code, as you've seen in our TNG and our TIXL model codes as well, very clear grounds for appeal that are articulated. And a very clear timeline. You have this long to appeal. You can't wait a year and a half. There's always going to be some exception down the way where somebody learns something new a month and a half later, and we'll consider those, but you got this amount of time to get in. Usually it's about a week. There's also just one appeal. We've seen this a lot in faculty grievance procedures where there's multiple levels of appeal that just go on forever. And that's something that, again, the courts don't really understand, and people from the outside looking in who don't understand or don't spend their lives in education go, why do you have so many appeals? You really just need one. And so there's one level of appeal. It's articulated clearly on the grounds that gatekeeper can then look and say, is this timely? Does it meet the grounds? If it's not timely, then it doesn't go forward unless there's some really exigent circumstance. And if it doesn't meet the grounds, then it doesn't go forward. And there'll be cases where some organizations may appeal on multiple grounds, and some of them might meet the grounds and some of them might not. And we would only want to pass on to an appellate decision maker those that we think might have merit, not necessarily do. And then when it gets to that appellate decision maker, some people say, should it be one person? Should it be a panel of three? Should it be a panel, and who should it include? That's really up to you. I will say that at TNG, we always prefer a committee for appeal. We think it's good to have 2 or 3 people who are unrelated stakeholders kind of taking a look at this and who understand how appeals work. And that understanding starts with deferring to the original hearing authority. This is one of those areas where we as a process need to assume, and this is how the courts do it as well, we assume that the original decision maker got it right. If we just grant every appeal and overturn everything, then why do we even have an original decision maker? Why did we have a panel or anybody like that consider this case, or a single administrator, if we're just going to not trust what they did? So there's always that deference. And one way I like to think about this, and then I'll hit this last button and we can move on. The way I like to think about that idea of deference is, this is the place where it shifts from the evidence either has to show that a policy was violated, as opposed to there being a burden. And you'll even see that in some of the other models that are out there, certainly our models. The Office of Civil Rights just recently, yesterday, commented on this very thing, where they stopped talking about burdens of proof and they started talking about standards of evidence. And I think that's an important distinction. But when you get to the appellate process, the organization does have a burden. Now they must show that there was error, and that error caused a significant change in the outcome or the sanction. And that burden is on them to show that. So it does shift from a standard to a burden here. Then we have to decide, or you'll have to decide, what you want to do with that appellate officer. Can that appellate officer just change the outcome? Can they just say, I don't think this organization broke the rules, I like their appeal, not responsible? Can they take a suspension or a deferred suspension and make it a probation? Can they take a deferred suspension and make it a suspension? Generally speaking, we would say that if an appellate officer or panel thought that there was error that significantly altered it, they should remand that back to that original decision maker and say, hey, I looked at this, this is what I think, and now you reconsider the case, as opposed to just having that authority to just say, I'm arbitrarily going to say, because I think I know more, this suspension should have been probation. If you are going to imbue your appellate body with that power, know that they're going to have to articulate really clear rationales, and that can put them in a very difficult place because they weren't in the hearing and they didn't see the entire investigation. They're only seeing the part that was appealed. And so it can really make them do what we call a hearing de novo, which is what you always try to avoid in an appellate process. So these appeals are really tight now. They're not that wide open. Everybody gets a shot and you can go cry to somebody and maybe they'll have mercy on you. It needs to be more structured because that leads to subjective and arbitrary decision making. And that's why we built this the way we did. Now let's talk about the implementation, Gentry. Let's get into a little bit of the meat.
So we want to spend the next little bit talking about some best practices in the implementation of this code. Some things that are directly referenced in the code, and some things that are really more connected to the broader implications of what implementing any code of organizational misconduct on a campus might look like. And to start, I'll kick it back over to Jeremiah to discuss our philosophy as a group about system-wide shutdowns and how this code plays into that conversation.
Well, first of all, I want to make it known that I'll take advantage of any opportunity to celebrate the accomplishments and legacy of fictional TV president Josiah Bartlett. So let that be known. An administrator's job is to have a really well thought out answer to the questions, what are you doing to keep people safe? And what are you doing to hold folks accountable when they fail to keep people safe? And when we don't have a really well thought out, intentional answer to those questions, the answer is often, we're doing everything we can think of, right? And so we tend to throw the kitchen sink at some things, and that shows up often and increasingly often in the form of a system-wide or campus-wide shutdown. This is a strategy that it's not effective in the long term, but it's certainly effective in the short term. It gets people's attention and it gets people to the table, but it also indicates that there wasn't probably a great sense of trust or history of communication widely across and between organizations when that happens. The thing that worries me about system-wide shutdowns, I mean, there's a lot of things that worry me, but the things that worry me the most is, it disincentivizes really good groups. Not all groups are created equal, and not all groups are deserving of the sort of restrictions that a system-wide shutdown promotes or lays out. It makes no distinction between groups. It's just sort of you're all sort of in this same thing, so we're going to treat you all the same. And so, again, when that's the case, it doesn't incentivize groups doing the best they can to protect the health and safety of their members and guests. And so, much to the chagrin of our friends at headquarters, there probably is a time for a system-wide shutdown, and maybe to the chagrin of some of our university folks, it's not always when we've been using them. We have to have thought about when, why, and how before we're in the situation of having to use that as a tool. So I think the best practices, if that's what we want to call it around system-wide shutdowns, are we have to do it with a clear end in mind, right? We can't do it unless we know how it ends. Also, we need to be able to know and articulate ahead of time, what is it that triggers the next phase of the process? How do we know that we're moving through the process? Because I think what makes folks nervous, from our students to alumni to our headquarters folks, is that sometimes there's no end, and we don't know how we would get to the end except for when we feel more comfortable. Again, there are reasons why we do that. Some of those are valid, but it's not something that encourages us to get in the trenches together and to solve this. So shutting a campus down just to figure out what to do next is unlikely to lead to a better resolution, and it's unlikely to build confidence and trust among those who really need to trust one another and have confidence in one another in order to get to a better place on behalf of students. And so we're not saying that there's not a time, but we're saying those times should be very few and far between, and that how those times play out, everybody knows that from the beginning. This is when it would happen. This is why it would happen. This is what would trigger it. These are the phases along the way, and this is what would bring it to a resolution.
One of the items that you will see in the model code is a clause regarding self-reporting and amnesty. Another feature of the code that we feel as a team really supports self-governance. It is specifically designed to promote self-governance, and even more specifically, it is designed to promote individual accountability. And Jonathan's going to talk about that in just a minute, that really, when we think about organizations, we're thinking about our individual students. And the question becomes, are they acting individually or are they acting collectively? Ideally, they're acting individually, and we're able to address them as such without implicating the entire organization. And we know that that is often the case. Very often when there's, for example, hazing within an organization, it's not the entire organization, but it's 3 or 4 individuals within the organization who take it upon themselves to take some new members away from campus and engage in behavior that would violate our policies. The self-reporting option gives student leaders, student organization leaders, the option when that sort of thing happens to say, hey, we're not going to take the fall because of these 3 people who decided to do this thing. So we're going to partner, we're going to report what happened to the university and work with the university to address just these individuals involved. And it's clear, one of the pieces of feedback that we got from some of the national representatives that we sent this to was, well, we don't feel like we should have to share internal disciplinary proceedings. And so I want to make clear, you don't have to. Self-reporting is totally optional, but what self-reporting does is gives you the opportunity to preempt any university investigation by partnering with the university, coming to the university and saying, this is what has happened, this is how we're addressing it, these are the individuals involved, and then the university can support that organization in addressing and dealing just with those individuals. But to be clear, It's optional. It's not something that organizations have to do unless they live in a state where it is required, right? So some of the new hazing laws in particular that we're seeing at the state level provide some pretty strict requirements with regards of if you're aware that something is happening, particularly if you're in a position of leadership, you might have some increased culpability as an individual if you're not coming forward and being transparent and reporting what is occurring. And the thing to remember with self-reporting is that a group comes forward, they say this happened, we're going to call those individuals in and investigate them. And in the course of that inquiry, if we feel like there's more to this, that there was some question that we might answer that Jonathan will cover in a minute with regards to maybe there's some organizational culpability, then we're going to say, you know what, pause, we need to dig deeper. But short of that, we're going to partner with the organization and incentivize them to hold their individual members accountable without dragging the entire organization into the conversation. This is something that we've seen work really well at campuses that have adopted it. And for those of you who've seen me do a training of this nature before, you know this is something that I've been preaching for a while. It was very important for us to get this into the model code. I think the model code also does a great job of really delving into the details of the interim restrictions process. That very often we will see a group of accused of even maybe very low-level hazing, and the immediate response of the university is to come in and shut everything down in that organization. And the analogy, Scott illuminated me recently that there's an old analogy in the military called a scalpel versus a broadsword. I had made up my own scalpel versus machete, but I replaced the machete with Scott's broadsword to make him happy, because I want to give credit where credit is due here. So what we see is that a lot of campuses will come in with their broadsword, just striking everything down. This model code is really written in a way that makes the interim restrictions much more like a scalpel. That you're trying, when you say, hey, we're going to suspend the operations of this chapter during the course of this investigation, we're doing that to address a very narrowly tailored interest, a very specific interest. And if there's a less disruptive method for us to achieve our means, then we should use the least disruptive method possible. Do we need to shut the entire organization down when we can just perhaps suspend the new member process? Considerations and questions like that we think are really important. And you'll see in the model code and the language that we've developed around interim restrictions, a lot of rights built in for organizations as it relates to this. First, the rationale for the restriction should be clearly stated. So if we're suspending your new member process, we're clearly stating to you why we feel that's necessary to do pending the investigation and adjudication of this matter. We also build in an opportunity for a review meeting, that if my organization is placed on some sort of temporary restriction pending an investigation, I can request to have that reviewed, and we can submit that in writing. We can have a meeting to discuss that. Important to note that that is not a hearing on the merits of the case, the review meeting, but rather just an opportunity for us to discuss, are the restrictions that we put in place the least disruptive that we can have in order to address any health and safety considerations that we have. And the other right that we built in for organizations into this process is that the registered student organization can request an additional review process if the investigation extends beyond 30 days. We really, as we discussed days and times and how long should this last, a month was really where we landed. We know that in exigent circumstances, there may be times when an investigation or adjudicative process lasts longer, but if it does, you owe it to that organization to sit down and re-review any interim restrictions that have been in place to see if we might scale some of those back, or we might feel that we need to keep them in place. So it was important to us to note that we know that these interim restrictions can be very disruptive for students and student organizations. We should use them in a limited fashion. We should be clearly stated in terms of why we're using them, and then we should build some checks and balances into that process to ensure that we're not leaving things in place for months while we slowly investigate and get to the bottom of the case.
Gentry, let me add one thing here just before you, because you talked about like new member. It's important that in the interim, the hearing on the interim restriction, that organizations be aware that it is not taking into account as much the weight of what this may feel like to the organization. You know, you talked about new member recruitment, but I also think about, I do a lot of work with athletics. And so we think about our club sports teams, right? So if we're going to put them on some sort of restriction where they can't represent and they're in the middle of their season or they're in the middle of the playoffs, the timing of it and what that might do to the team standing in a league or something like that is actually not as heavily weighted as the organization may feel like it is. It is a consideration, but we have to be very careful if you are the decision maker on the center and that you're like, oh, well, then they're going to miss the whole season. If you have that pushback, I'm trying to get out ahead of a question here, recognize that in athletics, an athletics director can just pull the soccer team for the year. And there's no hearing on that. It just happens. And so we're actually granting, in some ways, for some of these organizations, more rights in that interim restriction than they might get if they were actually a varsity sport. And so I think it's just important that everybody sort of understand this goes well beyond just like a recruitment phase, if you will.
That's a great point, Scott. One of the other things, and Isabel alluded to this during her review of Tier 3 and the formal investigative procedures, one of the other things that I think really stand out in this model code, and it's consistent with a lot of what we've seen in terms of guidance around Title IX, is that the investigator needs to be someone who is independent. That one person cannot be judge, jury, and executioner. And so the model that we've developed is an independent investigator model. And there's several questions that have come up about this. And this is a training that I've been doing now for years on a campus that only has one or two people in a conduct office, right? Where one person is supervising the other, one person's the adjudicator and the gatekeeper, so can't be the investigator. You need more people, right? And so what we've encouraged campuses to do, and the University of Texas really was the first campus to develop this several years ago, what they called their I-team, their investigation team. They had a team of cross-disciplinary folks from across the institution who they trained to serve as investigators in any number of places, including any sort of organizational investigation. And so the fraternity and sorority affairs person may not be the best person to investigate a fraternity or sorority, but they might be great to investigate that allegation on the intramural or club sport soccer team that Scott referenced, because they understand the nuance of hazing and organizational culture, and vice versa. The person in rec sports may not be the person who's investigating the club sports that they oversee, but would be great to lead an investigation into a fraternity or a sorority. My suggestion will always be send out an all-call within your Division of Student Affairs and say, hey, we want to build an interdisciplinary investigation team. You're going to receive some training. You're going to receive some professional development and the opportunity to be involved in the investigative process, particularly with regards to student organizations. And you'll have people crawling out of the woodwork. And we've done this on a number of campuses. People are eager to have the opportunity to hone those professional skills, to build some competencies outside of their functional area. So if you put that all call out, you'll be surprised with the response that you get. That training needs to include a number of things. They need to understand the psychology of hazing, because we know a lot of these organizational investigations will involve hazing in that third tier. An understanding of group culture, a lot that can be discussed in terms of questioning strategy. We could spend a half a day just getting into that, writing investigative reports, and then any training of this nature should include some case studies and some role play. And when you have that large cross-functional team, even if you're a student conduct office of one or two, you can build a firewall between the investigation and the adjudication, gatekeeping, and appeals process, right? And that's really the important thing, is that the person who investigates is not going to be involved in adjudicating, doesn't make decisions with regards to gatekeeping on the front end of the process or in the appeals. And frankly, the only involvement they're going to have after the investigation is coming in and serving as a witness in any eventual hearing that takes place, and that's articulated in the code. So really a lot of options out there to bring folks together and give them an opportunity to support you so that those offices of one in student conduct world aren't expected to lead all of those investigations on their own. I want to turn it over to Jonathan now, and we've alluded to this a little bit, but this code really emphasizes individual responsibility first. And then when we feel like questions go beyond the individuals, that there's organizational culpability, that if you look at the definitions in our violations section, the organization aided, abetted, encouraged, supported, right? So we really emphasize individual accountability first, but there's some times where we have to ask those questions of, is this individual or organizational, or is it both? And Jonathan will walk us through that discussion.
Thank you, Gentry. And when Gentry and I presented on this topic in the past, we know that sometimes this can be a difficult decision for campuses to determine. So we've tried to create some framework and some resources to assist you with this in the model code. We know that concerning behaviors occur with the poor decisions of one or more individuals. As a result, this should be a primary focus no matter what process you are utilizing. So again, back to Gentry's point, looking at individual piece first and then branching out to the organization part. The registered student organization should be held accountable if it aids, abets, incites, organizes, approves, or otherwise participates in any behavior that would constitute a policy violation. So that's our belief. If it fits one of those categories, then that's when we move forward with the organization misconduct piece as well. A thorough investigation will assist in determining the appropriate process to utilize and who should be held accountable and move forward with outcomes with, whether it be individuals, organization, or perhaps both. Questions to consider when making this decision. The first question is, how many members of the organization were present when the misconduct occurred or had specific knowledge of the misconduct before it occurred or while it was occurring? So knowing the specific number there. I know some people say, well, if 3 or more people are involved, or if 10% or more is involved, then it's going to be an organizational violation. We're not giving specific numbers and things because we know that depending on organization, especially on LSU's campus, we might have a group that has 350, 400 members, and 5 or 6 members is going to look different for that group than 5 or 6 members of a group that has 8 members. So again, not a specific number, but looking at, again, looking at that number just to comprise of what that looks like for the make up the organization. Also, what knowledge did the appropriate organization officers or advisors have of the misconduct? We want to know about that. What did they know? And when did they know it? And what did they do about it? That's the things we want to answer with those questions. What actions did the appropriate organization officers and advisors take in addressing, preventing the misconduct from occurring? So if they did have knowledge or had knowledge that perhaps something might occur, what did they take to prevent those things from occurring? Were members of the organization acting in concert, or did their membership in the organization serve as an impetus for the misconduct? So was this a process, a rites of passage process to be a full member of the organization? Was that how it was explained to them and whatever the behaviors we're looking at? The next one is, did the violation arise out of an event that was sponsored, financed, planned, or otherwise endorsed by members of the organization? The last question you want to ask yourself when reviewing this information after your investigation and through your investigation is there a pattern of individual violations that have occurred without proper remedial action by the organization? Meaning that, we had knowledge, we had rogue members doing things they shouldn't have done. However, we did nothing to stop that and perhaps maybe perpetuated those behaviors from with occurring with the group. Answering these questions through your investigation should guide you on whether this is an organizational concern, individual, or sometimes it can be both. Now we're going to look at best practices with suspensions and written return agreements. First and foremost, suspension should be for a specific period of time. The presenting concern should drive this timeline and what environmental factors must change in order for this group to be successful. Really looking at the why. Why should be the focus for the period of time for the actual suspension. So, we're not saying that 6 months, a year, 3 years, whatever the case may be, we're not giving you a time frame. The time frame really should be dictated by, again, the presenting concerns and what environmental factors have to change in order for this group to be able to come back to the campus in this environment successfully. So looking at that from that perspective should drive the time period for the suspension. Suspension may include, but not limited to, we have this model code, revocation of registration, cessation of university college funding, so support financially, restrictions of all operations, restrictions of university resources, removal from university housing or property based on lease language. We also would note that we want to make sure that the registered organization, national organization, or governing body, we're going to ask them to perhaps remove the charter and recognition. That was something we would be asking them to do. Hopefully this is not the first time they've heard of this concern, and we've been partnering with them the entire time in this process, no matter which process we utilize. So it shouldn't come as a shock or surprise. They shouldn't get a phone call out the dark from me saying, hey, we want to close the chapter. Hopefully they've had some, some input and some information shared with them, by us, with them up to this point. But again, asking them to rescind that national recognition, whatever that may be, whether it be a fraternity, sorority, or other national governing body or group. Something that oftentimes are not included in outcomes for suspension, we're looking at outcomes from from campuses across the country, is return agreements. We want to make sure you have a return agreement in your outcome, that we do think that at some point in time, it is appropriate for this group to come back to campus and be a successful, reintegrated group that's having positive experiences for their members. This is very important, unfortunately, often not times included in our university processes. So we've really added a section here to make sure that is included with this piece. With the return agreement, we want to make sure we outline specific conditions upon return. First and foremost, again, partnering with that international organization or governing body to making sure, again, what does that return look like? How can we successfully reintegrate them back into the community and having those positive experiences for the members? And also encourage you not to do things that would punish future members. I know sometimes I've seen in return agreements where maybe the group coming back are going to be on some type of social suspension for a period of time when they do return. Again, if those students weren't involved in the concerning behaviors, I would just question, why are we punishing them, future members who had nothing to do with the presenting concerns that led to the eventual suspension of the group. So again, just something to note on that piece. We want to make sure we include language regarding continued operation and consequences for continued operation. So letting them know that additional charges on the code, such as failure to comply, could be levied against the organization if they continue to operate even after suspension. So if finding you responsible in that piece, obviously that could lead to a longer period of time. Perhaps that group is suspended from the university and allowed to come back as part of that plan to come to rejoin the community. If an organization members attempt to restart under a different organization, having some language in there about recognition would be denied. Perhaps that's under your student organization policies as well, or Greek life policies, having that in there too to strengthen that piece, I think could be important for you. Once a registered student organization has completed that period of suspension and has met the conditions upon return, they may seek reinstatement by complying with the appropriate registration requirements. So what is that for your campus? We want to make sure we outline for that for them so they know who they need to go to once that time period is up, they've met all those requirements to rejoin the community. It's important to include that those steps would be, and making sure we are directing them again to the appropriate offices of the department who can help them navigate that once they have met those terms and conditions.
So working with stakeholders and outcomes developments, I think the biggest pieces to know here is the model code. Again, we're wanting to promote self-governance and build trust and goodwill with our students, our advisors, and our stakeholders. So the outcomes development process really should be collaborative, both between the organization and the university or college, and with those stakeholders. So involving them, providing yourself as a resource to the organizations as they develop their outcomes can be a really good way to, again, continue to build that rapport throughout the process. Build relationships with your campus partners before incidents occurs. So be training on your code with the key campus partners where this might interact with them if they work with organizations or athletic teams. And same with your students. Be training your students if possible, both in general to build some rapport and let them know who you are, and also on this code. Think also about how you're publishing this information and how you're sharing this more broadly on your website or what that looks like. So that again, you're able to be transparent and upfront about this is the process, this is what you're going to go through, and then training people on that. One thing to note is that your campus partners that you're training on this, those are the ones that you're going to want in your pocket to be administrative hearing officers too. So as Gentry alluded to, doing that all call to get those people, but also looking at who is working with these groups and who might be good stakeholders for other investigative processes.
So moving on to this is our last consideration, Gentry.
Yep.
So I'm gonna say really quickly, we've got a couple of questions. We've got about 23 questions in the queue. We will stay on a little longer to answer as many of those questions as we can. We'll see what we can do to accommodate the rest of those questions afterward, up to and including we may reconvene maybe for a 45-minute Q&A or something a week from now to see how many of us can be here. When you're looking at Title IX, I think it's important to remember that some of the allegations against the organization that could be systemic could also cross the discrimination line. And while I still hear at times, particularly from Greek life organizations who are exempt for purposes of membership, some of them still believe they're exempt from the discriminatory allegations that come under Title IX, and that's not how it works. You may be exempt in that you can have all one gender as members, but if you are discriminatory in other ways, most notably how this comes up in Greek life, sexual assault, sexual harassment, things like that. And that's part of the reason this whole project comes together as well. There's a real examination on some of the organizations that have historically, not just Greek life, but other organizations where there's been historical harassment or situations that lend itself to sexual assault. If you're going to have Title IX based offenses though, you've got to start figuring out how well your Title IX office is involved. And if those of you who are on the call who maybe have also been through some of the TNG or TICSA trainings on Title IX, starting to see some real parallels in the investigation styles that we recommend. Having more than one investigator is always a good idea. Making sure they're independent and separating decision makers. There's a good reason for that. And that's because these parallels across all disciplinary procedures exist. So if there is an incident that involves Title IX, and we do believe it to be systemic, who's going to investigate it? And as Gentry mentioned earlier, it may not be the right person to have the Greek life or the intramural person or the person who oversees club sports. Obviously can't do one, but if they're a trained investigator in this arena, they may be able to partner with a Title IX investigator and do that. But obviously they'd have to not investigate their own people. So if it's the rugby club got involved in discriminatory or harassing behavior, the person who oversees club sports will not investigate it. The Title IX office is for sure going to be investigating it. The real question is who can partner with that individual, because they're going to be looking for, because there'll probably be some student conduct violations and some org conduct violations that are separate from the Title IX violations involved. None of these things happen in a vacuum. And so just seeing who has the ability to implement the interim measures, who has the ability to do final sanctioning, how does that work? You're really going to end up working with your student conduct office, the folks who oversee these organizations, Greek life, and Title IX. If you're not paying attention to sort of what's happening on the whole, the sort of the global look, if you're in your niche role, the days of siloing are ending yet again in terms of we're all going to have to work together and manage these very, very serious issues. I'm going to stop there, and we're going to open it up to the Q&A. We've got some questions. Like I mentioned, I know we're coming right up on time now, and some of you have other obligations, and we recognize that. You will get a recording of this. You will get a copy of the slides. All of that will be made available to the participants. But let's jump right into the questions. And I'm going to go back to the beginning. While I'm doing that, Gentry, actually one of the questions talked about who did outreach about this process go to, who was able to give feedback, what was the diversity in those groups?
Yep. So appreciate that question a lot. Once we had a first draft of this policy, we sent it to around 30 individuals. And these are folks who have tremendous experience in both ASCA, through the Fraternity and Sorority Community of Practice, as well as the Association of Fraternity and Sorority Advisors, as well as representatives from all of the national governing councils. We received a good bit of feedback. We recognize the lack of diversity in terms of racial diversity with our development team. And so we were sure in the review process to send this to as many and as diverse a group as possible. And those who provided feedback are noted in the acknowledgments in the model code, and we thank them for their support.
Thanks, Gentry. Moving right along, the question is a jurisdictional question about official chapter houses as opposed to satellite houses. Where that stands right now, certainly, if you look at the Title IX and use that as your model, which I think you should, because that's what the courts are going to look at, they're going to decide what is if it's an official fraternity house and how many people live there and what is the standard for it. So if you don't have, and I'm just going to use Greek life as an example, if you don't have a house for a fraternity at all, but they're constantly living in the same house over years, it's now we're back to Isabel's, right? Looks like a duck, right? And here we are. It's definitely a duck. If you have one, but there's this other satellite house that's also one, remember, there's nothing that says you can't assert jurisdiction there. I think that's important for you to know. And what we saw in the Weckhorst and Farmer decisions is they said, if you're going to assert jurisdiction over individual conduct in those houses, you better be asserting other types of jurisdiction over more serious offenses. You can't let one go. So go ahead, Judge, please.
Yeah, I was going to say that the jurisdiction section is written broadly in such a way that it really addresses those downstream effects, any off-campus conduct that impacts the health and safety of students. So if we know that a fraternity has 5 seniors who live in this house, they do all of their social activities in this house that's off campus, the jurisdictional language that we've written in the model code would certainly apply, because certainly those sorts of arrangements have a direct impact on the on-campus health and safety of our students.
Right. There's 2 questions on this one. I think, Jonathan, really goes to you, but certainly everybody. Jonathan, so what about how would the tiered model look when there's repeated violations of the same type with the organization? And then the same one was, what if they violate tier 1 multiple times? So I know, Jonathan, you and Isabel both commented on this, so either one of you, please.
Yeah. So I can take the first one if Isabel, you want to take the second one. So the way that this is written, those outcomes were really for any of those processes. So warning, probation, deferred suspension, and suspension could result from a partnership process. I know that sounds strange and odd, but in my own experience at LSU, we've actually closed a chapter using the partnership process because the advisors were like, hey, we're trying our best. We can't change this. We need a break, agreeing that there needs to be some time away. And we actually closed a chapter using the partnership process because, again, they were partnering with us through the investigation. The advisor especially learned a lot more about what was going on. Leadership couldn't control their members, that sort of thing. So those outcomes are designed that if you come in at a warning, then you can obviously move up that tier if continued violations occur. Now, certainly if we believe the group is not partnering with us, they are not sharing truthful and accurate information, then again, partnership is a privilege in that right, that we can move to that formal process, adjudication process if needed, if we're not getting a true partnership perhaps from the students and or stakeholders involved with the situation.
And then related to the multiple tier 1 violations, I think what's important is that the university reserves the right at any point to move to a different type of investigation. So even if it is a tier 1 traditional violation, but you've had multiple ones from that organization or the same one a couple of times, at any time you can say, no, we're not going to do tier 1 anymore. We're going to offer either the partnership process or consider moving forward to a formal investigation.
Thanks so much. Jeremiah, how about this one? What are your thoughts on the length of time an org is placed on deferred suspension?
I guess I think that we just need to, I think it's not about the length. I think to suggest the length is arbitrary. I just think we need to have a reason for that length, and that reason needs to be related to what we're trying to accomplish through the process, right? And so, so I think if it's defensible, if everyone's on the same page, if our rationale is solid and it's consistent, I think I can make a case for various approaches to that. But I'll defer to others that are in this world on a more daily basis in terms of an ideal time. But I'm more concerned with the philosophy that's driving how we think about time.
I think we all agree with you, as long as there's a rationale. This is a quasi-jurisdictional question that came in. It was the next one up. So what if the alleged violation occurred before the current members were members? I'll speak from the jurisdictional side. That would have mean that if those students have left, we no longer have personal jurisdiction over the individuals involved. But if the behavior were attributed to the organization, we would still have jurisdiction over the organization as long as it's still recognized. From an investigatory standpoint, it gets harder, right? But I think we still have to look to see if it's systemic, if the behavior is there. And that's the thing. You can say, well, the hazing complaint came forward from behaviors that happened 4 years ago and all those guys are gone. We still want to see, is the behavior still happening? We just got the complaint because nobody wanted to complain who's in the group now. And to give you a great analogy of this that has this outside organizations and where some of this comes from, med students rarely complain about the doctors who are supervising them while they're in medical school, because they see that as contra to their interest in getting a fellowship, internship, residency, or a job. They wait till they're out, and then they come back and say, this is what was going on while I was there. And it's maybe not just that one doctor. You have to look to see, is it programmatically systemic? And so that's one of those things you look at. So just because they're gone doesn't mean it's a pass. Anybody want to add to that, or are we good? All right. John, I think they might have misunderstood. Why sanction a group with educational outcomes if there's not a policy violation? I think the slide said there could still be education. What?
Yeah, so I mentioned education, but not outcomes. So with that piece, in my thought process is even the conversation about the concerns can be educational for a group. So let's say that, going back to Scott's analogy, there was smoke in the rest hall, there was marijuana odor, but we never found marijuana. We never determined that marijuana was in someone's room or whose room it was in. There's still gonna be an educational conversation about those concerns, what that would look like, and just making sure that we're doing things to prevent perhaps future violations from occurring. So again, no outcomes as a result of that kind of conversation, but simply an educational conversation with that group and with the stakeholders about those concerns. Again, they may not have been valid, and that's fine too. And we can acknowledge that they weren't valid and move forward. But if they were, or if there were some concerning behaviors that maybe didn't rise to a level of a violation, let's talk about that and see how we can prevent those from occurring in the future.
How much information from the allegation do you recommend providing to an organization for their investigation? Gentry?
Enough to put them on the right trail, but anyone who's attended a training I've done knows keep your cards close to your chest, right? If you have to move forward with a formal investigation, you don't want to provide all the details and information that you have, but you want to provide enough general information. We've received an allegation about hazing involving these sorts of activities, very general, but not so general that they can't figure out what you're talking about. But you may choose not to divulge specific things related to time, place, individuals involved, in order to protect the anonymity of the person who might be reporting that, who may have requested it, and then B, to give yourself some cover in the event that the partnership process doesn't work and you end up needing to investigate that incident yourself. The more information you provide initially, the easier you might make it for a non-cooperative group to circle the wagons and work to get their story straight. So the short answer is enough to get them on the right trail, but not so much that it would hinder your ability to do what you need to do on the back end.
Yeah, and I think the crossover entry has to do also with the notion of if there's individual investigations going on. So I'll flip it back to that Title IX. So if we're worried about systemic harassment by one organization, but you have all these individuals who've been accused of the systemic harassment, this is why you got to work together. We got to decide who's going to get the letter first. How's that going to work out? What do restrictions look like? Because you could investigate a ton of individuals and then determine it's systemic. The individuals will know they're under investigation, but they may not know the organization is also under the microscope at that time. Yep. So these are decisions that you'll want to make in concert with other offices. But
and it's important to note the distinction between in the code what we call the preliminary investigation, the small I investigation, and the actual big I investigation. The small I preliminary inquiry is generally just you've received an allegation and you're trying to gather a little bit of information just to make you feel reasonably confident that there's enough information to go forward. That generally doesn't involve calling in a bunch of witnesses. You're not going to start calling in all of the new members in that preliminary investigation. When you've made that step, you're investigating. And if you've done that without notifying the stakeholders, that's going to go back to that issue of causing some issues with trust and transparency. So we need to be really careful about distinguishing what that small I investigation is versus, yeah, we've launched an investigation. Here's the notification. We're notifying the advisors, the stakeholders. And again, if it's, say, high-level hazing and we've not even considered the partnership process as an option, we're going to let them know what the allegations are. But again, very generally, we're not going to go into the specifics. Hey, we've received a hazing allegation. We think it came from a parent. That's what we're going to be investigating without getting into all the specifics of the information. We like to make parallels between the college disciplinary process and the criminal justice system. There's a 2,000-word document from the Department of Education that came out yesterday that tries to do just that. So to borrow that framework, police officers, when they're interrogating potential criminals, don't give them all of the evidence that they've already gathered before they sit down and do that interview, because that would make their job harder. We can carry that same analogy into the work that we do, that we're going to give you enough information so that you know why you're there, but we're under no obligation to share all of the specifics of the allegations that we've received. That
By the way, even in the Title IX regs, that's not required. They just need enough information to know what they're coming in for. No mystery.
What are you being accused of? That's right.
Yeah. Mount an appropriate defense was the term. I think you just answered the other question about the tier doesn't matter. We're going to do prelim into everything that comes in the door and decide what goes from there based on the conversation earlier.
And we offer, as Isabella said, a framework, just, you know, kind of generally what might fall into each tier. Every campus is going to be different, depending on the types of organizations you're working with, depending on the level of severity of cases that you typically see. I've worked with a campus that doesn't even have fraternities and sororities, but they have a cappella groups, and they see hazing in those, but they tend to be very low level. That might look different than, Jonathan, what you all would do at LSU, where you would immediately, with any sort of hazing allegation, go to a formal investigation, and not just because your state law now requires it. So the three tiers is really just a framework. Every campus is going to look different in terms of the types of violations that they put in those three tiers, and you can change it over time as long as you're being transparent about how you do it and why. What might be level 2 this year, we decide, you know what, we feel like this really needs to be a formal investigation, and we're gonna make that change.
So one of the other questions that came in, and Gentry and I both referenced this during the thing, and by no means is this a marketing ploy, but when you talk about training the investigators, you know, you have to train people how to understand bias and impartiality and trauma and hazing and groupthink and how individual investigations work and investigation strategy. Gentry and I have been working together for a very long time, both for TNG, Etixa, and Dyad. Thousands of investigators. I think we hit our 10,000 mark finally in terms of these sort of skill sets. So if you have people on your campus who've been through those types of trainings, and you're going to train that pool of people, which is a model we like as well to do investigators, you're not going to train an investigator. The student conduct office is not going to train an investigator and then hand them the attempted murder case, right? That's just not how it goes. You're not going to have, you know, Professor Smith over in the biology department isn't going to get handed the drug dealing case with 32 people in it. Like, no, you're going to give them a low end stuff, which lets you have your time to be spent on the higher level cases. That said, a botched up low level case can still result in a lawsuit. So those investigators do need to be trained in the process and how to do it effectively. And you can look at our website, you can look at the slides, and there's a lot of the characteristics that are in there. So you think about who handles the most high level stuff on your campus: Title IX office, student conduct, HR, in particular HR with terminations and tenure, and Title IX with sexual assaults are kind of the two worst things you deal with. So that's probably your best people to look to, what the skill sets they're being trained on and by who. How does the model code proposed account for student safety when it comes to the comment period? Meaning, students come forward and share info from orgs about their own behavior. how do you address and account protection of those individuals when they may be the sole source and identifiable based on what is shared? So I'm guessing, how do we protect that one guy who outs his own organization, or that one woman who comes forward and goes, we're a train wreck? You know, when the acapella woman comes forward and says, this is it, Gentry, how do we protect her?
Yeah, so a couple of things that are, I think, important to note here. You're going to interview everyone, right? So you may have the one person as the source of the information. Let's say the one fraternity new member who comes forward. I'm going to interview him just like I interview everyone else. And in writing that investigative report, and you'll see the language in the model code, it supports that investigative report will not name names, right? That the witnesses, those who we talk to, that information will be attributed anonymously. Now, where this becomes tricky is where you see that overlap with your individual code of student conduct. The model code is written in such a way that investigative report that is written with anonymous sourcing is the main source of information that's used in a hearing with regards to the organization. But if Jonathan is one of the individuals mentioned as being responsible, and we choose to charge him individually with hazing, does your individual student code of conduct and that process allow you to charge and take Jonathan through adjudicative process based on anonymous information? And it may or may not. And in such case, you're going to go back to that individual and ask, are you comfortable with us sharing this information? Otherwise, we're going to have to be very careful and thoughtful about the manner in which we share the information that we receive that balances our need to promote health and safety and address Jonathan's behavior, but also protect the anonymity of the person who brought that information forward. So it's very much a balancing act, but most of the time it can be done in a way that protects both of those interests.
And when it can't be done, you just need to be transparent about that. There's
Right.
only so much we can do.
There's only so much we can do with this. That's right.
So Jonathan, Isabel, Jeremiah, Mandy wants to know, are you envisioning all communication going through the organization president? If so, what do you recommend for ensuring effective and timely communication with their membership? My experience has shown that messages from the institution are either not communicated to the membership or not communicated accurately or without intense emotion that can create feelings of confusion and distrust. I'd say that she would probably accentuate that the higher the level of leadership that it goes, right? Thoughts from three of you?
I can speak to the partnership process piece. We actually have in our process where before we agree on that outcome with the organization, they are to present that outcome with their organization and get buy-in at a chapter meeting or organizational meeting first, because we don't want to have happen as a president to agree to the outcome is only in office for 2 more weeks, and then the new president comes in and is like, well, why do we ever agree to this? We shouldn't agree to that. This is not something we support. So I think that that's important to making sure that we have maybe some of those kind of checkpoints and processes in place where we ask them to communicate information to their members, maybe to verify that communication has occurred. So we don't find ourselves in a situation where, yes, Johnny may have agreed to this outcome. However, Bill now is the president of the chess club, and he does not agree with it and is actually vehemently against it. So we know it's not going to be long-term successful with that type of scenario.
I would also add that this is where having your stakeholders already a part of the process is really important to be able to, one, make sure that they know exactly what those outcomes are and to have some measures of making sure that that information is communicated. So whether it's an expectation that the coach or advisor is at the meeting where this is communicated or as a part of that conversation, having them on the same page there is really important too.
Great,
I don't have
thank you.
anything to add. I think that's great.
Yeah, so how do you, the other question that came in is, do you have any recommendations that might assist with creating a better partnership? And this seems to be like a little bit in the weeds of some suggested best practices, guys, with both your governing councils and your upper administration, as they both seem to be challenged and with holding organizations and or members accountable.
Can you say that again?
It's recommendations to help the partnership between the governing councils of organizations. I mean, specifically, this is obviously talking about Greek life, and the upper administration of the institution, because there's usually in between folks.
I'll say, and then I need to I apologize, I have to step away. I'll say that I just think we have to state the intention that we're going to have these relationships and that we're going to have these conversations. I know that, you know, as someone who's in the position that I'm in, it's really important for me to do my part to meet students, to meet advisors, to meet folks from headquarters. I won't even say halfway, wherever that way is, so that we actually know each other, we understand one another's intentions, and we're able to establish a line of communication. I know last semester I went and sat in a fraternity house for a couple hours and just took every question, and we left in a much better place. When I walked into the room, there were a lot of folded arms and furrowed brows. When I walked out, there were a lot of handshakes, and that's not because of my magnetism. It's because we were just able to sit together and have a conversation. And I don't think that happens nearly enough. And so I think that the more that we just sit together and have conversations, acknowledge the constraints that we're all working through, acknowledge that at the end of the day, we all want to land in the same place. I mean, it sounds really simple, but I think sometimes it is that simple. We've got to build relationships together, and that's up to me, and it's also up to others as well.
For the record, Jeremiah, I don't think your magnetism should ever be underestimated.
Well, I appreciate that. Have a great afternoon.
Thanks, Jeremiah.
There's a theme of questions in here that talk about, and I think we touched on it, but they're asking, there's two different pieces. So you have small offices, and we referenced it a little bit. They're only in fraternity, sorority life, student involvement, student conduct. They're one-person shops, you know, and some of them are one person and a student worker, you know, and the question is really kind of the theme of several of these questions is who can become the investigator if I'm the one person shop and I'm also the adjudicator? And I'll speak to it a little bit and then ask you all to chime in. We've already discussed the pool model. And one of the questions said, man, people in student affairs don't want to get anywhere near student conduct. And that might be true on your campus, but my experience with our clients has been somewhat the opposite. That when I ask for assistance from the staff and faculty, people who are willing to get involved, recognizing that they're not going to get, you know, the hardcore sexual assault case or something along those lines, that they realize they're going to be handling cases, but dealing with students at these crossroad moments, whether it's academic integrity, baseline student conduct, or even gender-based discrimination or civil rights-based discrimination. They want to be trained. And also, it's a really interesting skill set. I know, Gentry, when you and I trained together, you know, people were like, man, that's awesome. Like, I can use this in other facets of my life. And that's what it is. So student conduct office, you know, Isabel can train a faculty member on how to do an alcohol violation, you know, and how to do a, you know, minor in possession off campus, or a low-end marijuana case. Like, that's easy to do. And again, you're not asking to dump them into the big ones. They just need to understand the process, how to be unbiased, how to screen themselves, how to question, things like that. So I think you want to find people. The other thing I'll say before I hand it over is, if it's a high-end case and you're biased out and you can't hand it to one of those pool people, you're probably going to have to externalize the investigation, either within your system, if you're lucky enough to have a system, like a community college system or a state system where you can borrow from somebody, or you're just going to have to hire somebody. And if you do that, vet them and make sure they understand all the things that Gentry was talking about earlier, and that they've done these before, that they know what the hell they're doing. Because right now, after Title IX blew up a few years ago, suddenly everybody was a Title IX investigator. And so you got to be really careful.
The only thing I would add to that, you know, Scott, is, again, my experience is similar to yours in that the campuses that I've worked with that have put out the all call for investigators have gotten really good responses. If you try that and don't get a good response, that's where you go to your dean or your VP and say, hey, we need to designate within student life some folks to serve on this investigative team, and get that buy-in from above. If you're a small enough institution that you're a one-person shop, hopefully you're a small enough institution that your caseload is minimal, and so designating 2 or 3 people external to the office to serve in that capacity and one of those other duties as assigned would be the next step. But again, I have yet to have a campus that did the all-call for investigators and we're told no. So give that a shot. I think you'll be pleased with the results.
So we're coming up on being 30 minutes over time. So And I've been told that we only have the room for so long. So here's what we'll do. There's still about 15 questions in the queue and some more coming in. The group here will get together and see if we can either capture these questions and maybe send out an email with some answers and some thoughts, or we can always maybe host something a week or so from now and just do a 30-minute or 45-minute just open-ended Q&A town hall style. If you're interested in some more of these, I will do a little bit of a commercial. On Monday, TNG and Atixa are doing a look at the process based on the regs Gentry was talking about, just a quick shot of it. It's free, there is no cost. It's open to anybody who wants to come. I think we've got about 700 people in it right now. But yeah, we're happy to help. And you'll see the clear parallels in some of these because those gender-based discrimination cases also cross over into the organization cases. And that actually will come up. And some of these questions go directly to some of the answers we'll have there. So we're gonna have to wrap at that point. Gentry, anything you want to add, Isabel, John?
Two things. One, thank you everyone for participating. In an email tomorrow, you will receive the slide deck. You will receive a link to the recording of this webinar. And you'll also receive the email addresses of our 5 panelists and the folks who developed this code. And so if you have specific follow-up questions for any of us that weren't answered today, then feel free to reach out to any of us. We stand ready to help you in the implementation of this code and really appreciate everyone joining us today to discuss what I think is a really important issue, and hopefully what we've put forward is something that helps you do your work better. So on behalf of the whole development team, thank you to everyone for joining us, and stay healthy and safe, and we'll chat soon.